All right, everybody, welcome to today's lecture. I have the great pleasure of introducing Professor Eric Higgs from the University of Victoria. Now, that's in Canada. For some of you who don't know, it's an actual other country. So this makes one of our first international lectures this year. And let me tell you a little bit about Professor Higgs. He is working on pioneering research on ecological restoration that has been transformational and collaborative for scientists and practitioners. And he has brought international public and policy focus to restoring damaged ecosystems. He is a global leader who has long championed interdisciplinary science in the study of complex and changing environmental challenges. His long-term Mountain Legacy project has built the largest systematic collection of historic and repeat mountain photographs and data in the world as a unique research platform. He is also the author of the 2003 book, Nature by Design. Now that's what we're all here for, right? We're all designers. Can't separate those things. In his book, he positioned ecological restoration as a design practice. Professor Higgs was instrumental in developing the concept of novel ecosystems, which acknowledges the importance of and challenges created by historically unprecedented ecosystems arising from direct and indirect impacts. More recently, in the last 2 years, Professor Higgs has begun a collaboration with Christine Lintott Architects, a Victoria, Canada-based interdisciplinary design firm, to explore regenerative ecological design principles and practices. Welcome, Professor Eric Higgs.
Thank you, Esther, for that generous introduction, and to Courtney for getting all the audiovisual set up, and to Keiko for arrangements, and to Doris Sung for making this invitation possible. I met Doris in Italy at the Rockefeller Bellagio Center, where she was pursuing a three-way partnership, creative partnership at the Rockefeller Center, looking at some urban ecological design issues. And I just happened to be staying in the room above where their studio was. So Russell Hortmeyer and Sigrid Andresens and Doris Sung were working there, and somehow they adopted me. And so we got to have lots of fun and lots of great conversations over the several weeks that we were there together. And then we've kept up contact for the last number of years, and I've been thinking lots about design issues and ecology. I think it was my mother who advised me never to apologize before you give a presentation. But I want to apologize in the sense that I'm an ecologist. I suppose you shouldn't apologize if you're an ecologist, but I'm going to, because I'm in a school of architecture, landscape architecture, heritage conservation, and building technologies, and that's not my forte. So I'm an interloper, a trespasser on the ground that represents those design fields, and so I'm going to do my best to speak, authentically from what I know about ecological restoration and translate over to the work that you do. And it's possible there's going to be some things lost in translation, and I'm aware of just a tiny bit of how much thinking has gone into some of the subjects that I'll talk about today. So just bear with me. The other thing to bear with me on is that the miracle of Zoom has made it not possible for me to see notes or the next slide coming. There's going to be some adventure component to this presentation, and for that I apologize in advance too. I offer a territorial acknowledgement, and this is where my notes would help in particular. But I like to acknowledge the traditional and largely unceded grounds on which I work in what's now known as Victoria and at the University of Victoria, where the Lekwungen-speaking peoples have tended the lands and waters for time immemorial. And those traditions continue to this day. And acts of Indigenous resurgence are powerful where I come from. And I understand from reading that I'm doing that acts of Indigenous resurgence are also significant here in this region. So I want to acknowledge that. I want to thank also the team that I work with. I have a remarkable team at the University of Victoria, which, as Esther said, is in Canada. And for those of you who have a faltering idea of Canadian geography, Victoria is the furthest west large city in the country and is located confusingly on Vancouver Island, where Vancouver, the city, is not. So the Victoria is actually the capital of the province of British Columbia, which is Canada's westernmost province. And so in a sense, I'm coming to you just straight down the coast, as I did yesterday when I flew the length of it. And if you promise not to pass this along, the secret is that Victoria has a sub-Mediterranean climate zone. So we're actually more similar to San Francisco than anything else in the rest of Canada. So you might think of me as a refugee from the snow, but in effect, I am used to warm, dry summers and cool, wet winters, and extraordinarily ferocious climate intensifying weather events. And in fact, what do you think is the hottest temperature that's ever been recorded in Canada? Like 35 degrees Celsius, 40 degrees Celsius, 100 degrees Fahrenheit?
120.
It was 50 last year.
Yeah. So in 2021, during an extraordinary heat event, Lytton, British Columbia set 3 days sequentially of the hottest temperatures ever recorded in Canada at 49.6 degrees Celsius, which is hotter than Las Vegas has ever been. And the 4th day, it burned to the ground. So a lot of the work that I do is trying to understand how we relate to, engage with, and intervene responsibly in ecosystems that are experiencing change. Ecosystems are always changing, they're always responding to things. But now it seems like we're into a different kind of change that is perhaps step change, perhaps it's discontinuous types of change. It's hard to know how the complex relationships of living organisms are going to respond to this. So that's what I worry about. Maybe I should move on to the next slide and see what we get. So I want to play today in this zone. It's sort of a continuum, but I don't want to emphasize the continuum so much. Around architecture, landscape architecture, and ecological restoration. So that's the space I want to occupy today, to try to relate those. And mostly what I'm trying to do, because I'm such an outsider to the experience that you're having, is I want to speak about ecological restoration and see if there are ways in which we can connect and communicate across the other design disciplines. And to start with, I'm going to dive into 2 projects that I think blur the lines for me. And one of them is quite local. So this is the test plot projects, which is, again, if I had my notes, but the landscape design firm Terremoto out of San Francisco, I guess they have offices here as well, were instrumental in developing these or supporting these insurgent landscape projects, one of which is here on the USC campus. And Doris and I went wandering to find it. It actually turned out not to be very far away. And I understand one of you was directly involved. Sorry, again, my notes. Alex, thank you, Alex. Okay, well, we'll talk more. And I wish I had met you before I showed slides. But what intrigued me about the photographs that I saw, and then my experience of seeing it, were just how similar these are to the kinds of projects that I relate to on a daily basis in ecological restoration. So these are the kinds of photographs of, kind of site interventions that are not so dissimilar. And then when I looked at the guiding principles, they're lovely. This is the guiding principles behind not this particular project, but test plot generally. So I won't go through them, but you could get a sense of them. Experimentation is good, that there's permission to fail. Expansion and scalability, no one size fits all. Diverse ethics, low tech, low budget. These are all fascinating principles, which I've been thinking about in my own journey around restoration projects, and I'll come to that later. The other case I want to speak to is a much more general case, but my longtime friend and colleague Keith Bowers set up the company Biohabitats many years ago, tried to get it rolling, and now has achieved a great deal in terms of ecological restoration in the United States and increasingly in other countries, including Canada. And they just, I see, won the ASLA 2023 Landscape Architecture Firm Award, doing just really bold work. And when we look underneath their value propositions, here they are, and they're lovely. Revere wild nature, heal compassionately, practice wholeness, act with uncompromising integrity, which is quite remarkable for a private sector company. Although they have just recently announced earlier this year that they are becoming a perpetual trust. So they're kind of doing the whole Patagonia thing, if you know about that. So I think it's a really fascinating move, but so this is a company that does exclusively restoration work that's putting forth values of this kind. And they work a lot at the interface between restoration and landscape design. A little bit with the built environment too. All right, so my sense though is that the lines between these three practices, if we can even divide them up so clearly that way in a disciplinary sense, are blurred. And I want to explore that blur. Folks at the back, feel free to, yeah, take a pause and I'll sip coffee. So as Esther generously mentioned, in 2003, I wrote a book called Nature by Design, which was an audacious title, especially at that time. I'll come back to that too. And the idea of incorporating design in the practice of restoration was anathema to the field at the time. Most restoration practitioners circa 2003 held on to the idea that what we were doing was simply allowing natural processes to take form. And I argue that that was misleading, that every time we attempt an act of restoration, we're also inserting human agency into that space. And as such, I felt that what we needed to do was to take hold of that and think of restoration as a design practice. So that's what I argued back then. And I suggested that there were four primary irreducible concepts that informed restoration. And again, this is of that era, so 20 years ago, almost to the day. That ecological integrity, or some notion of integrity around how ecosystems function and whether composition matters. Historical fidelity, so tracing the continuity of an ecosystem through time. That's challenging now because of the rapid change that I mentioned earlier. This enigmatic idea of focal practice, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but think of it as the importance of human engagement in the act of restoration. Doris and I were speaking about this as we were walking and looking at the test plot project and thinking about how do you ensure longevity through human engagement in these landscapes? How do you do that? And I think that's what I was trying to get at. And if you want, well, probably best not to ask me what focal practice really means, because I'll go on for some length of that. And the final idea is wild design. And I propose this idea of wild design. It hasn't really been picked up too much, but the notion of it is that, of course, we design. So as restoration practitioners, we make decisions about which plants to pull out, which plants to add, which animals to manage, which ones not, and so on. But we know also that those ecosystems have agency of their own. And so we are simply partners in that process. And that's something that I think is really critical to remember. And you know, that expression you've probably heard, nature bites back. Restoration ecologists know a lot about that. So those are the four principles that I suggested were at the heart of how restoration works. And back then, could ignore, I'll reveal that 2.0 later. But back in 2003, we were dealing with what I now refer to as classical ecological restoration, in which history served as a template that there was only one trajectory, one proper trajectory for any particular ecosystem. And that there was an emphasis on composition. That's to say what goes where, what's growing and interacting where. So if we look at the practice of restoration, we see it at all scales and in all regions. There's tremendous diversity. This is a group of students working with the Ecological Restoration Club at the University of Victoria. They were removing 3 target invasive plant species to make room for plant reintroductions. We see this in projects close by to where I live, Sydney Spit, which is part of a national park reserve. And we have this immense problem with Scotch broom, which I think is also a bit of an issue. This is not quite as far south, further north, I think in California. Yeah. And so in order to get rid of this Scotch broom, we have tremendous amounts of volunteer labor assigned to trying to get it removed. And it's got a 40-year seed bank, so it's a long-term prospect. And all in the aid of these 2 critically imperiled plant species, which don't ask me the scientific name because they're in the notes, but on the left is yellow sand verbena, and the one on the right is contorted pod primrose. So these are actually listed federally as endangered plants. We call them species at risk in Canada, but same thing. And so that's why this particular activity is important. So this is a great, almost archetypal example of a small-scale restoration initiative. So clear goals and lots of volunteer labor required to address specific issues. And with considerable success, I should say. This has actually really worked, this project. I haven't spent a lot of time in the Los Angeles region, but I know there's a ton of projects going on under the guise of restoration in the greater Los Angeles area. And I just picked up on one that I remember having talked about and visited many years ago, which is the Los Angeles River revitalization. So lots of projects, some of you may be involved in a few of those, but just attempting to try to not restore, it's interesting the language that's being used, but revitalization, which seems about right. So we can look at different scales too. We can look at whole ecosystems like the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Project, massive scale, several billions of dollars have been poured into this initiative over more than 25 years to take a channelized mistake that was made in the 1960s and try to correct it. And significant progress has been made there. We can also look at restoration at regional scales too, and look at linkages. So this is in Banff National Park, a highway overpass for bears, well, other wild species as well, but bears in particular, proven very successful in reconnecting Banff National Park, which has a Trans-Canada highway running through it. So the highway is a nightmare for wildlife, and so those overpasses were significant for the bears. So overpasses and underpasses. So this is an example within that park itself where the hotspots are and where the connectivity needs to be to ensure those species are healthy. But we can look at it on an even greater scale. This is the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative. So looking at how it is you reconnect the landscape through diverse restorative initiatives along the whole kind of continental spine of the Rockies. But it's not just in North America where this is happening, it's happening all over the world. And just one example is the Gondwanaland project in southwestern Australia, which is doing also remarkable visionary work in trying to bring this landscape back together to give it greater intake. So restoration is happening at a lot of scales and in a lot of different ways. There's huge diversity in that. In 2021,
United Nations announced a new decade for ecosystem restoration. If you had talked to most restoration ecologists the year before, in 2020, they would have laughed at the idea that there would be a UN decade devoted to restoration. And the story of how it came about is an interesting one and a bit haphazard. But nonetheless, suddenly restoration ecologists, which were used to not being taken seriously and doing their work quietly in the corners of various institutions and ecosystems, were now suddenly thrust into the spotlight. A lot is changing. There's a lot of attention being given to restoration globally, not just to heal ecosystems, but also to address problems related to sustainable development, including poverty alleviation and human livelihood needs. And so you'll see that language throughout if you look at this. Last December in Montreal, the Kunming Montreal biodiversity framework was launched, and it was a remarkable event as well, and a surprise that countries contributing parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity globally came together and said, restoration matters, because here's what Target 2 says. Ensure that by 2020, at least 30% of degraded terrestrial inland water and marine and coastal ecosystems are under effective restoration. No one has any idea how to do that. Just one of the problems. But it's an audacious goal, and that's not so bad. But I'm not sure anybody is like, we're all scratching our heads. That's a lot. It's a lot of change really quickly trying to address that at the time when we're dealing also with many other rapidly changing challenges. So what's happened with restoration in the last few years, and I mean the last few years, the last 5 years, is that somebody has turned up the heat underneath it. And restoration is going, in a sense, viral, and we're hearing a lot more about it in lots of different contexts. So I guess you could say that restoration's time has come after operating quietly in the shadows for about 40 years, and the time early restoration initiatives started gaining ground. I see 4 defining challenges, and I'm going to take a little bit of a detour to look at some of these because I think they speak to the issues of rapid change. The first is the diversity of practice. Second, the diversity of ecosystems that restoration must contend with. The third are restoration adjacent practices. And finally, the issue of rapid change, which I've already gestured to, but I'll come back to it. So let's start with diversity of ecosystems. I don't even know where to start here. I mean, it's such a vast project. We did a comprehensive assessment nationally in Canada over a 2-year period starting in 2020, looking at what we know about restoration in Canada. And as part of that project, we did 3 detailed case studies of different restoration initiatives. And when I pulled those up, I realized that they're so profoundly different, each one. So the first one is about Gary Oak, or what people in Northern California call Oregon white oak, Quercus cariana. But we have, we're the northern range of Gary Oak ecosystems. These are culturally modified ecosystems and very, very rare and endangered at the moment. So we were looking at that. Second was salmonid or salmon restoration at Fundy National Park on the east coast of Canada, marine and freshwater project. And then this vast peatlands restoration initiative going on in northern Quebec and northern Ontario. So it's hard actually to square these 3 case studies, you know, in terms of just looking at the diversity of practice that is underway, the different kinds of ecosystems. And if we look at a map of, yes, this is Canada, where's home? Home is right there on the west coast. So if you, this is a map of ecological regions in Canada, and you can get a sense of just how diverse the regions are, ranging all the way from this wet maritime climate on the southwest in British Columbia, all the way across to Arctic regions, boreal, and so on. So just a lot of diversity. And then if you look at British Columbia, where I live, it's like California. Actually, I don't know if it vaguely looks like California, but the topographic complexity and meteorological variety, all the different things going on with respect to what creates diversity in ecosystems is tremendous. And so this has the highest biodiversity of any of the provinces in Canada for a good reason. So when you think about the diversity of ecosystems, it's hard to kind of understand how it is that we can accommodate a single view of restoration across all that diversity. So if we look at diversity of practice, I was thinking of how do I represent this? And one way is to flash back to June of this year when we had the largest gathering of restoration ecologists in Canada since 2004. We gathered together in Quebec City, about 800 of us. And I just took some snapshots of the conference, some of the conference program. You can't read that, but suffice it to say that the diversity of how people are going about doing restoration is extraordinarily diverse. And again, if you were to try to encapsulate best practices or appropriate guidelines, or try to bring restoration into a single way of functioning, it's hard to imagine how you do that given the diversity of practice. And then there's the restoration adjacent projects. So I pick on a couple here. I do a lot of work on a small island known as the Gulf Islands. If you know the San Juan Islands, north of Seattle, the Gulf Islands are simply the Canadian version of those same biogeographic area. We just call them different things. I work on one of those islands called Galiano Island. It's a hot spot of restoration activity. And recently, we worked in an area that had been an agricultural zone for over 100 years. So intensive agriculture and drainage, a whole bunch of things going on. And we undertook restoration treatments to try to withhold water, to stop water from going out into the ocean quickly. And this, we call this the Cedars for the Next Century project. Western red cedar is such a critical species, both culturally and ecologically in our region that, and with climate change, there's legitimate fear that Western red cedar is going to get hammered. It's already dying back. So could we, by transforming this agricultural area into a wet forest and series of wetlands, could we actually help sustain Western red cedar? The thing that's kind of challenging about this project though, and these are my students who were out doing monitoring last summer. This is just a year after the project was installed. What's challenging is that we actually have very little historical idea of what that specific plot looked like. And what we're interested in is anticipating where this ecosystem is going in the future with respect to temperature and precipitation and plant composition. And so we're monitoring it and creating a very sort of adaptive management approach. And we're tentatively referring to it as future forward restoration. So less emphasis on the past, more on the future. So I don't know, some people would call this restoration unapologetically, and others might say, oh, I don't know, you're not taking history seriously. So I introduced this as exhibit 1 in looking at restoration adjacency. But we can go to much wilder projects. Some of you may know the Changichang River Restoration Project in Seoul, Korea. This was a $1 billion investment. This is more than a decade ago. I think one of the earliest and boldest inner city major restoration initiatives, which took a stream that had been culturally very important in the founding of Seoul and a touchstone literally for the city itself. And over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, had become seriously degraded, so much so that a highway was put over top of the stream, and then a second level highway was put over top of the stream, and the stream disappeared until it was restored. And so the highways were removed, and the entire project, I think, was done in under 2.5 years. It was amazing. what happened. And so it still has that kind of, you know, highway channel look to it. But there's actually a lot of active diversity in this space now. And the place that's variously referred to as the Green Heart of Seoul, although, you know, the Parks Department in Seoul has been extraordinarily active and innovative with the work that they've been doing. So this is an example of a restoration adjacent practice. A lot of my restoration ecology colleagues look at this and they say, yeah, not restoration. It's like urban infrastructure or landscape design practice, but not restoration. But I'm not so sure. I think it's pretty interesting. In fact, I would say that there's a retrieval of deep history in a project like this. All right, and then one of my favorites is an article that appeared in Nature this year, giving profile to a major initiative in the Netherlands. An archipelago constructed of sand and mud is bringing new life to a dead lake, but can this bold experiment have lasting impact? That's the tagline. This is the Marker Wadden project, and it's takes place just north of Amsterdam in the Marker Mere, which was a freshwater lake created by a dike that cut off marine flow into the estuary that used to reach all the way to Amsterdam. Challenge was estuaries, when flooded, don't make great lakes, they're too shallow. And so this was a failed lake. There are toxic algal blooms. It's a very windy area, so there was a lot of mixing of the water column. So it was just kind of a failed lake. And an unusual collaboration between the world's largest dredging company, the largest NGO, nature NGO in the Netherlands, and the government, federal government in the Netherlands, resulted in a project to build a new archipelago using, just a shout out to my colleague Han Olf at the University of Groningen in the Northern Netherlands, who was a lead scientist in advising on this project, because there aren't too many people who actually know how to create an archipelago from scratch, dedicated to nature, not to people. So this is, at the time, the largest vacuum dredging rig in the world. So a meter diameter vacuum hose, sucking up marine sediment and repositioning it to create these islands. And it looks like a vast mining operation, the way that I've taken these photographs. But I had the privilege of being out here in the early stages of the development of the project. And it's pretty remarkable, both the scale and the ambition of this project. But also, you don't need to read Dutch to know that that's quicksand. Yeah, it's a dangerous place to be, at least when in the early stages of development of the project. But it's also a kind of a metaphor for the complications around projects like this. I mean, marine sediments being used to create freshwater archipelago at great cost to meet European Union biodiversity goals and create literally de novo habitat. And if you look on Google Earth or Apple Maps, you'll see the Marker Wadden Islands appear now. So they must exist. So let's talk about rapid change. Anyway, I wanted just to, before I move on, just to say that those projects are like complicated for me. It's not clear, like they speak to restoration, but they're not exactly restoration. So what do we do with them? Let's move to rapid change. And this is featuring work that of the Mountain Legacy Project, which is a project that I had the pleasure of directing for more than 20 years. It's long-term ecological research looking at change in Canada's mountains. We just got lucky by coming across 120,000 systematic, high-resolution, comprehensive survey photographs taken in the late 19th and early 20th centuries of practically every pointy bit of rock in Western Canada. So we've been working with those historic images and repeating them. And this is what we've learned. This is 1914 in Waterton Lakes National Park, from the highest point in that park. It's right on the US border, by the way. And that's what it looked like when we went back in 2004. But about this time of year in 2017, a fire crested the Continental Divide and moved into Waterton Lakes National Park, and in 4.5 hours burned 40% of the park's area at high or very high severity. So this is a fire that hasn't had the attention as some of the fires in California have had, or even the fire that occurred in Fort McMurray that burned a good part of a city down in northern Alberta. But nonetheless, this is a really significant climate-related fire event. And so a lot has happened. So let's watch what happened. So that fire burned into this valley, and you see very significant change in the vegetation. But what my team is working on, 2 PhD students in particular, James Tricker and Claire Wright, are looking at how it is we can take these images and classify them. So we're using machine learning to automate classification of landscape patterns. Ignore the lower left or lower right. This didn't know how to deal with shadows in the early stages of training. So bear with me. And this is what it looked like in 2004, and enter the wildfire. So you get a sense of the scale of transformation in that, just this one portion. So we've been working with point clouds, so digital elevation modeling, as a way of being able to figure out how we can take these oblique angle photographs and reference them for overhead projection and work with geographic information systems. So this is the work of Claire Wright, who's done some very sophisticated draping and reprojection of these images. So this is the exact same image I showed before, looking down across the valley, but now it's projected overhead, and overlaid on that are the vegetation patterns. So that's 1914, and we can look at the change. So conifer forest moving upslope, not a surprise. And then let's look at the fires. So these are landscape changing kinds of events. We're seeing them all over the Mountain West. And we're seeing not just single events like fire, but we're also seeing pathogens like mountain pine beetle. And we're seeing invasive species. And we're seeing extreme water events that are transforming these ecosystems perhaps in ways that we haven't seen before. So that's, I think, a testament to this idea of rapid change. By the way, if you're interested, Doris knows I can talk about these photos forever, so I'll stop. But if you're interested, these are all open source, publicly available imagery from this website, explore.mountainlegacy.ca. And you could while away an evening looking at lots of cool mountain images. And if you're interested in more about the project, give a shout out to the Future Ecologies podcast. It's a Canadian-based podcast doing really innovative work at I think the edge of culture and ecology. So they did a feature on our work, which I really like. Okay, so those are the 4 defining challenges. Lots of diversity of both practice and ecosystems and restoration, hard to kind of wrestle it into a single form. And all these different kinds of practices that are adjacent to restoration and then rapid change. So a lot going on, trying to figure out what's coming. But there's other things too. So we can't just stop at those challenges. There's at-risk species, historical references, indigenous resurgence, poverty alleviation, sustainable livelihoods, it goes on, ecological novelty, shifting cultural values as well. There's now, have you heard the term nature-based services? So that's a huge shift in the last 5 years. We weren't talking about nature-based services using that language a decade ago, and now we are. So it connotes, that's one example of a shift in our cultural values about nature. Okay, so back to this diagram that I mentioned at the beginning. So let's expose restoration 2.0. And this was from work done a decade ago with a team of ecologists and paleoecologists, philosophers and historians, in which we said restoration 2.0 needs to be much more flexible. History can be a guide, but not a template. ecosystems can pursue multiple trajectories under new conditions, that there's an emphasis more on process than composition, and then we need to have pragmatic goals to accommodate livelihood needs. So that cultural engagement. So that's all good. So Restoration 2.0, we're seeing a different view of it, but other things have been happening too. And I reflected on this in an article I did for the MIT Press Reader on restoration's ambition. This came out 2 years ago. Talking about what's happened in the last 2 decades in restoration. And I had a quote from this article in my notes that I can't read and I can't remember. But just suffice it to say that in 2003, we were not aware of issues of rapid change and shifting cultural values in the way that we are now. And that's why I think we need to reflect on a different kind of restoration in the present. So we could sort of acknowledge that and pause there. But I think there's more. And this is where it gets, I'd love to talk more, but I realize my time is coming to an end. So, but this is from an upcoming article that my colleague John Volpe is lead author on, in which we're looking at new technologies and how they're going to influence restoration in the future. So everything from de-extinction to genetically modified organisms, gene drives, synthetic organisms, manufactured habitats, and so on. And trying to get a sense, not in a value-laden way, but just trying to understand the diversity of what's coming at us with respect to innovations that may affect and challenge restoration. And we go so far as to even say that maybe we're heading towards a restoration 3.0, in which there's increasing novelty of organisms and sites with respect to restoration. We'll see. But you have to start somewhere. All right, so that's a lot of change. And I think this, to go back to the Marker Wadden project for a second, is probably an example, an early example of what I see coming in terms of the dramatic ways in which we're going to be creatively reimagining our relationship between restoration as a deep form of intervention alongside a more design-oriented practice. So hope all that makes sense. Now, try to wrap. I'm about ready to complete here. Just give me a few more minutes. We take all this mess that we think of as restoration and we try to guide practice. And people have been trying to do that for the last 2 decades, starting way back with these definitions. Society for Ecological Restoration advanced way back 20 years ago. And the first national level guidelines in the world came out of Canada in 2008. And those were followed up in 2012 by international guidelines from the IUCN. And Society for Ecological Restoration went back in 2019 and came up with new ideas of how to guide practice. They called them international standards for practice of restoration. Sorry, this was 2016 originally, and then they revised it in 2019. There it is, second edition. First edition is a flop. Second edition a bit better. And then IUCN is back at it recently, trying to take the UN decade and give some guidance out globally on how to think about restoration. So a lot going on. But the models that are emerging, I think, are actually working against the kind of collaboration that we might want to have across design practices. And here's why. The first has to do with this, seems like an arcane argument, but I wrote an article with colleagues about the relationship between principles of restoration and standards of restoration. And argued that there is a difference. And then in this messy, diverse, open field of restoration, that principles matter more than standards. We can't standardize the practice yet, maybe never. And so, we can look at how principles can be backed up by guidelines, and we can give good advice to practitioners without necessarily locking it down and saying this is how you should do it. And when I was reflecting, perhaps naively, you'll tell me naively, I'm sure, about architecture and how it needs to be practiced, it's a lot about hard edges and regulatory oversight, liability, lots of standards, project delivery is key. People don't like it when their buildings don't get built on time. With restoration, maybe there's softer edges, less regulatory oversight so far, fewer liability issues. Ecosystems can cause problems, but not usually like problems when roofs fall in. Principles are more effective than standards so far, at least with restoration. And there's kind of ongoing adaptive management that's key. Very seldom do you have a restoration ecologist who pats themselves on the back and says, okay, we're done here. Our work is done. Usually it's ongoing and it's adaptive work. So I'm trying to get at this space, trying to look at those relationships. And if we go to the Society for Ecological Restoration, the problem that's arising is they've developed a continuum model, which says that on the right-hand side are fully recovering ecosystems. And this is the no plus ultra of restoration. This is the target you aim for. And everything else is a paler view of what restoration could be. The unfortunate part of this is that the work that most of you do is over here and a long way away from realizing what the Society for Ecological Restoration wants to say is the right way to do restoration. And this has charged a lot of us up with the idea that maybe this isn't a great model, that a continuum model may not be what we're looking for. And so I began to think about a continuum versus a big tent model. And what would that look like? And of course, there's the world's largest tent, at least as I could find it. It's in Australia. And so how big is a restoration tent and how big should it be? I'm not sure. But if we start articulating all of the things that are going on, this was in the zone of what I think of as the restoration zone, mostly. We have tons of things going on: rewilding, reclamation, remediation, assisted colonization, rehabilitation, forest landscape restoration, and on and on. So these are all practices that are legitimate and recognized that are restoration related. But then there's the design-oriented ones. So ecological design, green infrastructure, regenerative design, agroecosystems. These are sort of at that, in that space, but related still within the tent, I think, in the big tent. And then there's the technology ones that are coming. Drone swarms are already being used in forest restoration work. De-extinction, we're hearing lots about. Nanorobotics are coming online. Gene drives are about to be tested. So things are happening, and this is all in this space. And I think we need a big tent to accommodate the view of how this works. All right. So just to wrap up, how does all this relate to where we're going? Well, Esther generously mentioned at the beginning that I've undertaken in the last 2 years a collaboration with a local interdisciplinary design firm in Victoria, British Columbia, Christine Lintott Architects, who's doing very cool work in lots of different ways, both with mostly architecture, but landscape architecture as well, and trying to address the living building challenge, and a whole bunch of other things. And we have, we're working with 2 PhD students, one trained as an architect, the other as a landscape architect, trying to look at blurring those lines and seeing where we can get to through specific case studies. We're not quite settled on what those are going to be yet, but under this idea of regenerative ecological design. So that's what I'm trying to work with, and why in some ways Doris and I have been talking again about some of these overlapping themes in our work. So I invite, just before I close, just to invite conversation around that, and I'd be excited to hear your ideas and trying to get a sense of all of the different things that are going on that might inform this kind of collaboration. So if this goes well, we started pinning down some design principles that look eerily but independently developed, but eerily similar to what the test plot principles were, but just ideas that are starting to inform our work. And we're hoping to bring a larger collaboration together around this to see if we blur those lines, but also connect more strongly across. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Eric, thanks so much. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A now. Do we have any questions from the audience? I see a hand, Eric, you.
Thank you so much for a really beautiful presentation. That was super powerful. I know you mentioned this early on about the air overpass. That's really fascinating for me because I know we have worked on our own Annenberg overpass after the death of P-22, and so I was kind of curious about any design strategies that were implemented, especially about the location. Was that based on a freeway system, or how the bears kind of traveled or navigated?
Yeah, it was fortuitous that there was a local resident of Banff National Park in the town of Banff, Peter Poole, who did a PhD in transportation engineering at MIT and just happened to end up in Banff. And so he was able to look at sort of globally innovative strategies for moving animals across landscapes where there were these big linear interruptions. And so they did a lot of ecological work to get a sense of where they had collared lots of bear, elk, wolves to get a sense of where they were moving and where they had lots of data on where mortality was on the highway. So they were able to pull all that together and look at ideal sites. There are 4 overpasses, I think, right now in the park. And the general consensus is they've been hugely impactful, in terms of reducing mortality and reconnecting the landscape. But sometimes you get lucky, right? You get, expertise you don't expect. I think the woman at the back was.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Thank you for your talk. I'm just curious, as an ecologist, sorry, can't speak today. Would you say you have a more positive or negative outlook in terms of the health of our planet and say climate change and global warming, especially within the next few decades? And more importantly, why you feel that way?
Well, I was described in print as cheerful, which is not, for hard-edged, critical academics, being called cheerful is like a bad mark against you. But I don't know. I think we're scared shitless, actually, if I can say that. I mean, I think everyone is right now. I think these severe weather events are really triggering for a lot of people right now. We just feel like we're losing any sense of control. That's an awkward word, isn't it? But any sense of predictability. And that's deeply worrisome. But what drew me to restoration years ago, and what keeps me there, is that it's a fundamentally hopeful practice. It's one in which we can deal with, come to terms directly with what we do that's damaging, and then try to address that, counter it. And it's a personal journey as well, right? I mean, it's partly about understanding what our role is, my role is in creating the damage in the first place, and then trying to come to terms with that. That's an aspect of restoration. There's a shame dimension to restoration that we have to go through. It's a process you have to go through, I think. So I would say that most restoration ecologists I know are, they'll get a year or 2 into them and they will start, telling you how they really feel. But I think they continue to do their work because they are hopeful. I'm hopeful. But it is a difficult time. It's a difficult time. It feels like we're close to tipping points. Yeah, sorry. 2 years ago, I might have said it.
Thank you for the lecture. That was really interesting. I'm interested in this idea of kind of climax species and keystone species, and I don't have I kind of have a sketchy understanding of those terms myself, but how those kinds of ideas of rewilding can be applied to environments that are more drastically modified, like cities.
Right.
Where if you take New York City, for example, there was a state that existed there before there was a city. But now that kind of wilderness condition there is the city. So kind of how to approach this kind of idea of rewilding and kind of identifying the missing links there, maybe key species, key kind of plants, key animals that how do we even go about kind of identifying where that equilibrium to rewild need to work towards could be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the work that Eric Sanderson and his colleagues did in New York City with the Wallachia project, trying to get back to what Manhattan and the 4 other boroughs looked like at the time when Henry Hudson sailed his ship in whatever it was, 1608, up the Hudson River. It was remarkable work and the sleuthing that was required to kind of appreciate that. I think that kind of historical memory and reprojection is critical because it starts to radically reposition our understanding of the place that we're occupying, even if there are, as some, forgetting her name. She co-authored a book on layered landscapes, but this idea of laminations in landscapes over time and being able to appreciate which ones you can work with, how you choose to change and intervene to gesture back to that is really important. From an ecological perspective, though, I think we underestimate the power of connection in cities. We tend to think of we're very, egotistical in believing that we matter and species like us matter. But actually, if you're an insect or a bird, the city looks very different. And you move through that space quite differently. So creating isolated gardens on rooftops for pollinators and bird nesting habitats and roosting habitats, being able to start connecting green space, retrofitting buildings, having new design principles for new built environments and park space is pretty important. Zoning regulations matter too. The city of Vancouver is, well, we'll see how the experiment goes in the long run, but they've actually doing a lot of development credit trading so that people can build taller, skinnier towers in exchange for more public space at the ground level. And that opens up possibilities for more connectivity and recovery, rewilding, if you will, of city space. That's a partial answer. I lost track. Yes, please.
Thank you for the lecture. The question that I have regards indigenous cultures and the practice of design with nature, designing with nature. In 2018, I lost a house that I designed to the Woolsey wildfire in Southern California. We just finished it. Thanks. It led me to a lot of research about wildfire and historic land practices in Southern California, including indigenous peoples, Chumash people, and the work in cultural burning and the kind of land management through fire historically. And it seems this is not my area of expertise, so that's my apology maybe at the beginning of this question is coming from the architecture side of things. But it does seem that in the 20th century, there was a real emphasis on the natural landscape was the natural landscape and the constructed landscape was the constructed landscape. And humans were, really not to intervene in the wild landscape. Then there was this other stuff. And it seems now, especially what you're saying and other things that I've read, there's an interest in the way indigenous peoples have participated in the design of the landscape and the ecology. And I wonder if you see changes to that in terms of how we are approaching wildfires as this massive climate change issue that we're seeing. Certainly in Canada and the east coast of the US, but here in California, we're affected tremendously.
Well, I've been thinking about these issues a lot because I am trying to build a house in a very dry, fire-prone landscape. So I think about this daily. And I'm not designing it though, just to be clear. I'm just having. I think, if you go back to the work of Elmer Stewart and Kat Anderson, who's at UC Davis, and Hank Lewis, the late Hank Lewis, they were really early in recognizing the significance of indigenous practices in fire management in landscapes around the world. So from the boreal forest to California to Australia and so on. And I think there's a lot of interest. There's active practices going on in British Columbia right now with First Nations, collaborative practice, First Nations-led fire management to try to bring back some of the traditional ways in which fire was used and how it was being used. Because they were reducing fire risk and traditionally, for sure, because they didn't want to deal with fire anymore than we want to deal with fire. So The challenge right now, though, is how do you do that without engaging in a second level colonization? So how can you do that in an appropriately decolonial way? So you're not just taking these great ideas that Indigenous people worked on for time immemorial and grab those and repurpose them in the service of modern development. I think that's the challenge at the heart, and I think it's possible. So the collaborations that are going on with tribes in California, where I live, are have lots of promise. Is that I don't know, is that part of an answer?
No, it does, and from what I've read, there's been a lot of legal problems for tribes setting fires or being arrested and just wild things like that, where there is no understanding or collaboration.
Yeah, there's lots of perils, and we'll make a lot of mistakes along the way too. But hopefully we see it changing. And there's also I'm learning a lot about simple things we can do around fireproofing. But oh my goodness, those fires that are coming in are just, and perhaps what you were dealing with directly was of a scale that's hard to comprehend. There's a fascinating new book by Canadian. He's the fellow who wrote The Golden Spruce, if some of you have heard of that, but the new book is called Fire Weather. It's worth reading. It's about the Fort McMurray wildfire.
Well, I've done a little bit. By the way, thanks for bringing up Test Plot. We're also looking for volunteers anytime. Testplot.info. Following on the Cat Anderson and Indigenous practices, I think one basic lesson from that book is that all these landscapes have always been managed, always been stewarded for thousands of years. And so, we're looking at a future where we're going to be the stewards of a more involved way. And I would say that stewardship is something that's really critical for Test Plot. We're trying to reinvent how we steward the land. Different models, because there's a tremendous amount of labor required to do any of this work. And also, the people that steward the land are going to be the kind of most consequential designers, I think. So there's I think there's an interesting intersection with, between this idea that we have to, for designing, we're not just, restoring, obviously, and then we're also becoming stewards in a different kind of way. We're practicing in a way that architects don't normally practice, or just get done, walk away.
Right.
There's a longer term engagement, and then it kind of merges all the design and the identity and practice of the stewardships into the landscape as well. So you end up with something like connection. I think we're looking at potentially that kind of connection in some form. But I wonder if your world is really thinking too much about that identity that you have as designers, or just rethinking how stewardship is part of that whole process. If that conversation has started and evolved.
Yeah, wonderful question. If you look at how restoration is being taught right now, it's being taught as an ecology first technical practice. That's what is largely taught. That's where it starts. If we were to radically transform how we do restoration along the lines that you're describing, we would start with human engagement. We would start with what the relationship is between people and ecosystems, and how it is that we can redraw that relationship, in very profound ways, because ultimately that's what it has to change. That's the most radical transformation. We can green up our buildings, but that's just a gesture, and it's an important gesture, but it's a gesture. It's a more meaningful and radical change is what I think is embedded in Test Plot's principles, right? Or I can't remember exactly what the one is that refers to that specifically. In the principles that we started working with, we say ecology comes first, but only just people matter a lot. And not because it's an arrogant assumption, but it's kind of assuming the responsibility we need to have to act well within that place. I don't know, that's where it starts for me. I'm rethinking a lot of it, but I think we're scaling up restoration really quickly, and I think we're not doing it with enough attention to this idea of stewardship.
I think that's a great place to end.
Okay.
And I would ask, all the students who are here at the faculty, are you integrating ecological quality? Are you thinking about the integrity of ecological systems in your work? And if you're not, you know, how do you expect someone like Professor Higgs to be optimistic and cheerful? Okay, and all of you who, you know, as I hear, some folks out there really are grappling with the fatalism and negativism, a feeling that it's already we've passed the tipping point, as you mentioned. This is how to change the tipping point. This is how to be more optimistic, is by this being present in your thinking every day, all the time. It's not something that we come to at a certain point in the project and think, okay, now how do we do that? How do we solve it? We take care of all the HVAC, now how do we do ecology? It's gotta be there from the beginning. So Professor Higgs, thank you so much for coming.